V'Sechazena by Eitan Katz from his album Unplugged. How's everybody doing? It's great to be with you. A good Moedim L'Simcha, an early good Shabbos. We go into the final days of Pesach, Passover, tonight. Let's light up the darkness. Turn that off. Who is with us on a Thursday afternoon, special time, getting ready for 7th day Pesach? Guy in Ohio, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Melissa in Great Neck, James in Indianapolis, Allison in Fayetteville, North Carolina, Nancy in North Carolina, Paula in Chicago, Gwen in Michigan, Sharon in New Jersey, Cheryl in Texas, Paula in the Great Northwest, Bonnie in Texas. Welcome, everybody. Great to have you with us. Let me get adjusted here. Today, we're on Daf Mem Hey, page 45 here in Tractate Yevamos, the 14th volume of the Talmud. We are in chapter 4, continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 9. Generally speaking, this Mishnah deals with this case where a Yavam and a Yevama, right, the widow of the man who died childless and the surviving brother, performed chalitza. They didn't perform yibum. They did the alternative mitzvah of chalitza. So then she was released from the levirate bond. She can go marry whoever she wants. If she had a co-wife, the co-wife is also released without having to do yibum or chalitza. Having done chalitza, this Yavam and the Chalutza, the woman with whom he performed Chalitza, are considered like divorcees, except that a divorcee you could remarry as long as she wasn't with another man in the meantime. But a Chalutza, you're not permitted to marry after having performed Chalitza. But what if they did? Or what if a divorcee was with another man and then came back and married her previous husband? They violated a prohibition, so we forced them to divorce. In the Beis Din, right? The rabbinic court would force them to divorce in that situation, or to split up. But what if they had children after they reunited? Rabbi Kiva says that child is a mamzer, but the rabbis, the majority, disagree and say we still force them to split up. But if they have children, they are not mamzerim. They are not mamzers, right? So a mamzer, very bad situation, very bad status to have. A Jew who is a mamzer is only permitted to marry other mamzers, no other Jew among the Jewish people. So you definitely don't want to end up being a mamzer. It's a terrible situation because the mamzer ends up being a mamzer through no fault of his or her own. Rather, it's because that person's parents violated a prohibition. What kind of prohibition? The kind that for violating it, the penalty is death at the hands of the heavenly court, kares. Rabbi Kiva says perhaps even for a prohibition, the penalty of which is just lashes, you would end up being a mamzer. But the rabbis overrule Akiva in this and say only for a prohibition that results in kares would you be deemed a mamzer. Okay, well, let's continue with this. So the Gemara, we picked this up at the very bottom of 44b. The Gemara considers the status of other children born from forbidden unions. Rabba Bar Chana said that Rabbi Yochanan said, all agree with regard to a slave or a Gentile who engaged in intercourse with a Jewish woman, that the offspring born from such a union is a mamzer. That's a scary statement right there. We've discussed this before, haven't we? That a Jew is not permitted to marry a non-Jew, right? So under Jewish law, that wedding is not a real wedding, that marriage is not a real marriage, and it's not a permitted marriage. Prohibited for sure. But is the child of a Jewish woman and a non-Jew a mamzer? Haven't we all heard many times that it goes according to the mother? So if a Jewish woman ends up with a non-Jewish man, the child is Jewish. Now, you can be Jewish and a mamzer. Mamzer, by definition, is Jewish. But did you ever hear that that child is a mamzer? I will, spoiler alert, the end of this debate is that the child is not a mamzer, right? So if a child is born of a non-Jewish father and a Jewish mother, it is not a mamzer. But it's going to be a long and circuitous debate to get to that outcome. So let's see how the rabbis get there. It's not a given, right? So like when this debate went on for a long time, and there were a lot of sages who said, no, that child is a mamzer, so much so that here where this debate is being introduced, it says all agree that the child of a Gentile and a Jewish woman, a Gentile father and a Jewish mother is a mamzer, right? All agree, but it's not all agree, as we shall see. The Gemara clarifies who is included by saying all agree. It is Shimon Hatimni, as although Shimon Hatimni said that the offspring of relations for which one is liable for violating a prohibition is not a mamzer, this applies only to forbidden relations for which one is liable for violation of a prohibition, concerning which a betrothal between the couple would take effect. However, here, with regard to a Gentile and a slave, since their betrothal of a Jewish woman would not take effect, right? There is no betrothal, there is no Jewish wedding between a Jew and a non-Jew, or even, now a slave, it's interesting, a slave could be a Jew, but when he has the status of a slave, no, right? A Jewish woman cannot marry a slave, cannot marry a Gentile. Since their betrothal of a Jewish woman would not take effect, a union with them is comparable to forbidden relations for which one is liable to receive kares, and therefore the offspring of such a union will be a mamzer, according to Shimon Hatimni. Now the Gemara raises an objection from a baraisa. In the case of a Gentile or a slave who engaged in intercourse with a Jewish woman, the offspring born from such a union is a mamzer, right? So far we have all agree, Shimon Hatimni, and now this baraisa is saying offspring of a Gentile and a Jewish woman is a mamzer. It seems like a lot of evidence is piling up on that side of the debate. What's going on? The baraisa says, in the case of a Gentile or a slave who engaged in intercourse with a Jewish woman, the offspring born from them is a mamzer. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says, the offspring is a mamzer only if born from relations with one who is forbidden by a prohibition or forbidden relations that are punishable by kares, right? What's punishable by kares? For example, if you marry your sister, right? An incestuous relationship, or even the co-wife of a prohibited relation, that's punishable by kares, right? So that the offspring of that union would be a mamzer. Is it prohibited with a penalty of kares for a non-Jewish woman to have consensual sex with a non-Jewish man? Not clear yet. It is apparent from the baraisa that one who holds, as Shimon Hatimni, that only the offspring from forbidden relations for which one is liable to receive kares is a mamzer, nevertheless holds that the offspring of a slave or a Gentile and a Jewish woman is not a mamzer. So rather, Rav Yosef said, who is included by saying all agree? It is Rebbe, meaning Yehuda Hanasi, the redactor of the Mishna, as although Rebbe says in a baraisa on page 52, we're on 45 now, so in a week, concerning the Mishnah, on page 50a and 51b, that states that a levirate betrothal, right? Remember the levirate betrothal between a Yavam and a Yavama, they don't need betrothal. They ought to just perform Yibum if they're going to perform Yibum, or they can perform Chalitza. They shouldn't betroth. If they do perform betrothal, right, that's levirate betrothal, the betrothal of a Yavam and a Yavama. It's a problematic betrothal because if they decide not to go through with it, then they need both a get and chalitza, right? And as we've discussed before. So a levirate betrothal between a Yavam and a Yavama with whom he had already performed chalitza. So if they already perform chalitza, they're not allowed to get married. You cannot marry your chalutza. And if they performed a betrothal, it is ineffective. This statement was said only according to the statement of Rabbi Akiva, as he would consider a chalutza like a forbidden relative, such that if the Yavam betrothed her, it would not take effect. And if it did take, and if they got married anyway against that prohibition, this is where Akiva would render the child of that union a mamzer, but the rabbis would not. They would say that's not a mamzer. And although Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi himself does not hold accordingly with regard to that issue, with regard to the offspring of a union with a Gentile or a slave, he concedes that the offspring is a mamzer. So according to this view, Rebbe says that the offspring of a Gentile and a Jewish woman is a mamzer, according to this interpretation. As when Rav Dimi came from the land of Israel to Bavel, right, to the Jewish community in Babylonia, he said that Rav Yitzhak bar Avudumi said, in the name of our master, meaning Rebbe, with regard to a Gentile or a slave who engaged in intercourse with a Jewish woman, the offspring is a mamzer. The Gemara cites a related incident. Rabbi Acha, the lord of the capital, because his family at one time had sort of, they were the ministers. They were the local authority over the Temple Mount. Rabbi Acha, the lord of the capital, and Rabbi Tanchum, son of Rabbi Chia, the man of Akko village, redeemed those captives who came from Armon to Tiberia. One of them had been impregnated by a Gentile. And they came before Rabbi Ami to ask what the status of the offspring would be when it's born. And he said to them that Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Hanina all say, with regard to a Gentile or a slave who engaged in intercourse with a Jewish woman, the offspring is a mamzer. Upon hearing this, Rav Yosef said, is it so great to enumerate men? The fact that several great sages held this opinion does not prove that their opinion is the accepted halacha. It's almost like when people are unsure, right, of the ruling, they're going to bring more authorities to prove that they're right, because they're not right. Now, usually when we have, somebody said in the name of somebody who said in the name of someone who said in the name of someone, it's because it ends up being the halacha. But here it's like, and this guy holds, and this guy holds, and this, they're not saying in the name of who said in the name of who said in the name of, right, which is a nice provenance for a halachic ruling. Rather, he's saying, well, all these guys agree with me, so it must be true. But Rav Yosef says, no, it's not. But there are, says Rav Yosef, there are Rav and Shmuel in Bavel, in Babylonia, and Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi and Bar Kapara in the land of Israel. And some say to remove Bar Kapara from this list and insert instead the elders of the south, who all say, with regard to a Gentile or a slave who engaged in intercourse with a Jewish woman, the lineage of the offspring is unflawed, and he or she may marry into the congregation of Israel. Unflawed is, a sort of problematic term because we're not saying that the offspring of that union may marry a Cohen. But it is not a mamzer, and it can marry any other Jew besides a priest. Rather, Rav Yosef said the halacha is in fact that the offspring is a mamzer, because this is Rebbe's opinion. As when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael, he said that Rav Yitzhak bar Abu Dimi said in the name of our master, meaning Rebbe, that they say, with regard to a Gentile or a slave who engaged in intercourse with a Jewish woman, the offspring is a mamzer. So clearly, this was a problematic issue, and there was a lot of argument about it, even among the Amoraim, like the sages of the Gemara, who were in turn were arguing about what it was that the Tanaim had said, what the rabbis of the Mishna had ruled. And it seems like they're bringing a lot of authority on the side that that child is a mamzer. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says, the lineage of the offspring is sullied, and if the child is a girl, she is restricted in whom she may marry. And the Gemara asks, to whom is she prohibited from marrying? If we say it is to the congregation of Israel, but didn't Rabbi Yehoshua himself say that the lineage of the offspring is unflawed, and he or she may marry into the congregation of Israel? Rather, the offspring is prohibited to marry into the priesthood, may not marry a Cohen. As all of the Amoraim who render the offspring fit to enter the congregation of Israel agree that the offspring has flawed lineage and is forbidden to marry into the priesthood. And this is derived from a Kal V'chomer inference from the law of the widow, like this. Just as in the case of a widow who is married to a high priest, right? A high priest cannot marry a widow. So if a widow marries a high priest, so that prohibition that she violated pertains to her, and it is not equally applicable to all Jews. She may marry any other Jew, including any other priest. The only person she's prohibited from marrying is the high priest. And nevertheless, her child from that union will have flawed lineage, right? So the child of a widow and a high priest is a Jew, is not a mamzer, but may not marry any priest. Whereas if she had married any other Jew than the high priest, her child would be fit to marry a priest. Her child from that union will have flawed lineage. Well, then so too with regard to this woman who engaged in relations with a Gentile or a slave, where the prohibition that pertains to her is equally applicable to all Jews, right? No Jew is permitted to have sexual relations with a non-Jew. Isn't it logical that her child from that union will have flawed lineage? For sure, it's going to have flawed lineage. How flawed? Flawed in the sense that cannot marry a priest. And if one would say that the logic of this Kal V'chomer inference could be refuted by claiming that what is true with regard to a widow who is married to a high priest, where her union with him is what makes her herself disqualified. The fact that she married a high priest, we step in and break up that union. They're not allowed to remain married. They shouldn't have married in the first place. And after she comes out of that marriage, can she then go marry a priest? Before she married the high priest, she was permitted to any other priest. She was only a widow, and widows can marry priests or any other Jew. But now that she violated that prohibition and married a high priest, when she comes out of that marriage, she is no longer fit to marry a priest. She can marry any other Jew, but not a priest. So she is herself disqualified from subsequently marrying any priest. And if she's the daughter of a priest, she is disqualified from eating teruma because she married a high priest, even though she was a widow. And is it not true with regard to the prohibition against a Jewish woman engaging in relations with a Gentile or a slave? Wait a minute. She has disqualified herself from marrying a priest or eating teruma. But this is not true with regard to the prohibition against a woman engaging in relations with a Gentile or a slave. She's prohibited to do that. But having done that, does she become disqualified from marrying a Jew after she's done that? No. Is she disqualified from marrying a priest? Yes. This is not correct because here too, once he has engaged in intercourse with her, he thereby renders her unfit to marry into the priesthood, right? So she can come back and marry a Jew after she was married to a non-Jew, but she can no longer marry a priest. As Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Shimon, from where is it derived with regard to a Gentile or a slave who engaged in intercourse with a daughter of a priest or with a female Levite or with a female Israelite, so any female Jew, that they thereby render her unfit to marry into the priesthood? How do we know that? As it is stated, Leviticus 22:13, but a priest's daughter, when she will become a widow or a divorcee and have no child, she returns to her father's house as in her youth, meaning she's a priest's daughter. She can return to her father's house, and therefore she can eat teruma, right? She can eat consecrated food that only a priest and the family of a priest may eat. The verse indicates that she returns to her father's house and enjoys the rights of the priesthood only in a case where she engaged in intercourse with one to whom widowhood or divorce can apply. She can return to her father's house after she becomes a widow or a divorcee. Can a Jewish woman be a widow or a divorcee of a non-Jewish man? No, because under Jewish law, she was never permitted to marry the non-Jewish man. So she's not a widow or a divorcee. She simply had sexual relations that were prohibited and never married that non-Jewish man. Obviously, we're not talking about secular law here. We're only talking about Jewish law. The fact that she had a wedding from a justice of the peace or some renegade rabbi who violated Jewish law by marrying her to a non-Jewish man is irrelevant to this discussion. Because only Jewish marriage between a Jewish man and a Jewish woman can result in her being a widow or a divorcee. So, i.e., one with whom her marriage would be valid and would be broken only through death or divorce, then she can return to her father's house if she's a priest's daughter. Excluded from this is a union with a Gentile or a slave, to whom neither widowhood nor divorce can apply, as no marriage bond can be formed with them. Abaye said to Rav Yosef, "What did you see that you rely upon Rav Dimi and his tradition that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi holds that the offspring of a Gentile or a slave and a Jewish woman is a mamzer?" Now we're going back to our original question of today. Rely instead upon Ravin, as when Ravin came from Eretz Yisrael, he said that Rabbi Nassan and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rebbe, both rule that the offspring is permitted to marry into the congregation of Israel. So it's very interesting, right? We've had different sages say, well, the law is that the offspring of a Gentile and a Jewish woman is a mamzer because Rebbe said so. And now we have a different sage saying the law is that the offspring of a Gentile and a Jewish woman is not a mamzer because Rebbe said so. Both citing the same authority, but citing different rulings in his name. And who is the Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi referred to in Ravin's report? It is the one who is simply referred to as Rebbe, the redactor of the Mishna, whose opinion is accepted as the law. And the Gemara notes, and even Rav rules that the offspring is permitted, as is evident from an incident involving a certain individual who came before Rav and said to him, with regard to the offspring of a Gentile or a slave who engaged in intercourse with a Jewish woman, what is its halachic status? And Rav said to him, the lineage of the offspring is unflawed. The individual who asked the question was himself such a child, and he said to Rav, if so, give me your daughter in marriage. And he said to him, I will not give her to you. Before I continue this discussion, I'm just going to read it one time to be clear. Here is the halacha, the law on this question, as cited by Rambam in Sefer Kedusha, Hilchot Isorei Bia, and in Shulchan Aruch. Right, so this is definitely the definitive answer to what is the law on the child of a non-Jewish father and a Jewish mother. With regard to a Gentile or slave who engaged in intercourse with a Jewish woman, the offspring of such a union is fit to enter the congregation of Israel, therefore not a mamzer, irrespective of whether the woman was married or unmarried and whether the intercourse was consensual or forced. Interesting, even if she was married, meaning if a Jewish woman who's married to a Jewish man had an affair with a non-Jewish man, even that child is not a mamzer. Whereas if she had an affair with a Jewish man, cheated on her Jewish husband with a Jewish man, then that's a death penalty offense, and the child of that is a mamzer. But if she had an affair with a non-Jewish man, not a mamzer, right? So that's the law on that question. Now, so this man who was the child of such a union of a non-Jewish man and a Jewish mother came to Rav and said, so what is the law? Is the child of a non-Jewish father and a Jewish mother a mamzer or not? And Rav said, not a mamzer. So the man said, okay, Rav, give me your daughter to be my wife. And Rav said, I will not give my daughter to you. Shimi Bar Chiya, Rav's grandson, said to Rav, people often say that a camel in Meads can dance upon a small space that holds only a single kav of produce. A camel in Meads can dance on a kav. However, clearly that is an exaggeration, since if one would go to Medes, one could demonstrate that this is a space that holds a kav, and this is a camel, and this is Medes, and yet the camel can't dance. I.e., the truth of a statement becomes apparent when it is put to the test. So too, it would appear that you do not truly believe in your ruling, because when put to the test, you are unwilling to rely on it. Right? So let's just review here. So the guy says, my father was not Jewish, my mother was. Am I a mamzer or not? Rav said, you're not a mamzer. The man says, well, there's a lot of debate about this question, and people are unsure, and so everybody's being stringent because I might be a mamzer, so nobody wants to let me marry their Jewish daughter. So since you're making the definitive ruling, let me marry your daughter. And Rav said, no. And then Shimon Bar Chiya, who was Rav's grandson, says, everything is good. It's all talk. Like people say, a camel in Medes can dance on a kav, a very small space. And we know it's not true, right? Because if you go there, it's not going to be true. Meaning that Rav, when push came to shove, Rav wouldn't let this man marry his daughter. So Rav said, even if this man, right, the one who is the son of a non-Jewish man, even if he were as great as Joshua, son of Nun, right? Joshua, like from the book of Joshua, who led the children of Israel into the promised land. Even if this man were as great as Joshua, the son of Nun, I would not give him my daughter in marriage. And my refusal to give her to him in marriage is not that I do not stand by my ruling. It's for other reasons. And he said to him, so Shimon Bar Chiya said to Rav, if he were as great as Joshua, the son of Nun, then even if the master, meaning Rav, would not give him his daughter, well, others would give him their daughters. However, with regard to this man, if the master, meaning Rav, does not give him his daughter, others will not give him their daughters, either out of fear of damaging the family lineage or some other reason. If you don't give him your daughter, no one will give him his daughter. Nevertheless, Rav remained unwilling to give his daughter to that individual. The individual would not go from standing before Rav and continue to plead with him, give me your daughter, give me your daughter, give me your daughter. Rav placed his eyes upon him and he died. That was not the solution, right? You're not a mamzer, says Rav. And if you haven't found somebody who will give you their daughter to marry you, well, keep looking. Go somewhere else. The answer for your problem isn't to force me to give you my daughter. I have other plans for my daughter. My daughter has other plans for her marriage. Just because you haven't found someone who will, give you the daughter to marry, don't come to me and say I'm your only solution, because the guy wouldn't leave Rav alone. This was one of those situations that we see in the Talmud sometimes, that if a sage gets fed up with you and gives you that stare, it's a deadly stare. And the man died. The Gemara adds, and even Rav Matana rules that the offspring is permitted, and even Rav Yehuda rules that the offspring is permitted, as is evident from the fact that when a child of a Gentile or a slave and a Jewish woman came before Rav Yehuda, he said to him, go and conceal your paternal lineage, so that people will not refrain from giving you their daughters in marriage, as it is permitted for you to marry into the congregation of Israel, or otherwise marry a woman of your own kind, i.e. a woman of similar lineage. And similarly, when such a person came before Rava, he said to him, either go into exile to a place where your lineage is unknown, so that others will give you their daughters in marriage, or marry a woman of your own kind. Now, from the fact that they said to these guys who have non-Jewish fathers, go somewhere and just don't talk about the fact that your father wasn't Jewish, it is clear that that person is a Jew and is fully permitted to enter the congregation of Israel, or these great sages wouldn't have said that. So what they're saying is, the people who don't want to marry you, okay, they're being very particular. There's no halachic reason. There's no Jewish legal reason why their daughters can't marry you. So they want to marry, people with great lineage. They want their daughters to marry the sons of Torah scholars or, important Jews with a lot of Jewish lineage and Jewish history. But there's no legal reason why their daughters can't marry you. So go somewhere where the question won't come up. they're saying they're acknowledging that it's tough for that person to get married in the Jewish community, but there's no legal obstacle. The residents of Bey Mikse sent the following question to Rabbah. With regard to the offspring of one who is half slave and half free. Now, in this whole discussion, we've been focusing on the Gentile, but every time the ruling has said the son of a slave or a Gentile and a Jewish woman. Now, let's look at the slave component of this. This is a Jew who is a slave, right? Now, the woman is not allowed, a woman cannot marry a slave, and therefore, since she can't marry him, this question comes up whether their children is a mamzer, the child is a mamzer or not. The answer is no. The child of a Jewish slave and a Jewish woman, not a mamzer, even though their marriage is not permitted. But what about the child of a man who is half slave and half free? We've encountered this before. How does that happen? Because he's co-owned by two masters, and one master frees him. So half of himself belongs to him. The other half still belongs to his master. Obviously, this hasn't existed in thousands of years, but when slavery existed, okay. So with regard to the offspring of one who is half slave and half free, who engaged in intercourse with a Jewish woman, what is the halakhic status? What is the halakhic status of their offspring? He said to him, Rabbah said, now that with regard to the offspring of a full slave, we say that his lineage is unflawed, is it necessary to ask about a half slave? You would think that since the offspring of a slave and a Jewish woman is definitely not a mamzer, well, a half slave and a Jewish woman certainly wouldn't be a mamzer. You might think, and you'd be wrong. Rav Yosef said, the master who is responsible for the dissemination of this halacha, that the offspring of a slave and a Jewish woman is not a mamzer, who is he? He is Rav Yehuda, as the Gemara cited above. But, now we're on 45b, didn't Rav Yehuda himself say, with regard to one who is a half slave and half free, who engaged in intercourse with a Jewish woman, that offspring of that union has no recourse to be able to marry. It is apparent then that even one who permits the offspring of a slave to marry into the congregation of a slave does not permit the offspring of a half-slave to do so, contrary to Rava's assertion. And the Gemara explains, when this ruling of Rav Yehuda was stated, it was referring to a case where the half-slave betrothed a Jewish woman. Now, a slave's betrothal does not take effect. A slave cannot betroth a Jewish woman, right? She can't marry a slave. That's why this question came up, even though the sexual relations with a Jewish slave, right? Why would it produce a mamzer? Between a Jew and a Jew? Because they're not married. Why they're not married? Because a Jewish woman can't marry a slave. Can she marry a free Jew? Obviously. But this one is half slave and half Jew. Since half of him is a slave, this woman cannot betroth this man, cannot marry this man, right? Where a half slave betrothed a Jewish woman. They went against the prohibition, they did it anyway. But a slave's betrothal does not take effect. And the result of that betrothal is that the woman is married to only the free half of the half slave, half free man, such that it emerges that when he has relations with her, the slave side of him is engaging in relations with a married woman to whom that side of him is not married. And so the offspring of that union is a mamzer. I mean, this is, it's hard to get our minds around this. But because this person who is half slave, half free, really has two full statuses in the same person, such that if you betroth this woman, okay, so the free side of him is betrothed to her, but the slave side of him is not. And so if he as one individual has sex with her, the slave side had sex with a married woman. And that's why the child she's married to the free half of him. But the slave side of him, a Jewish slave, had sex with a married woman. And so the offspring of that union is a mamzer. and that is the law, is a mamzer. And the Gemara raises an objection, but didn't the sages of Nehardea say in the name of Rabbi Yaakov, according to the statement of the one who renders the child of a Gentile or a slave and a Jewish woman unfit to marry into the congregation of Israel, he renders the child unfit even when the mother is an unmarried woman. And according to the statement of the one who renders the child fit, he renders the child fit even when the mother is a married woman. And both of them derive their opinions only from the law of one's father's wife, as follows. The one who renders the child unfit holds that just as with regard to one's father's wife, you can't marry your father's wife, one's betrothal of her does not take effect even after she is widowed or divorced. And so, obviously you can't marry your mother, but if your father had a second wife, and then she was widowed or divorced from your father, could you then marry her? No, she remains prohibited to you. And so the offspring of such a union is a mamzer. And so too, with regard to anyone for whom betrothal of her does not take effect, including a Gentile or a slave, the offspring is a mamzer. And the one who renders the child fit, the one who renders the child of a Jewish woman and a Gentile or a slave fit, which is the law, so the one who renders that child fit holds that the derivation from the law of one's father's wife is more limited, and it is derived that the offspring is a mamzer only in a case just like one's father's wife, in that, although his betrothal of her does not take effect, with someone else, his betrothal of her does take effect. And this is to the exclusion of a Gentile and a slave, for whom betrothal of any Jewish woman does not take effect at all. And so the offspring of such a union will not be a mamzer. And it is apparent from this statement of the sages of Nehardea that according to the lenient opinion, the offspring of a slave is never a mamzer, irrespective of the marital status of the Jewish woman. Therefore, the Gemara's resolution is undermined. So the Gemara offers a different resolution about this half-slave, half-free man. Rather, when this statement of Rabbi Yehuda was stated, it was referring to a case where the half-slave, half-free man engaged in intercourse with a married woman who was married to someone else. And it therefore emerges that although the woman's union with the slave side of him will not render the offspring a mamzer, the free side of him is engaging in relations with a married woman to whom he is not married, and due to that side of him, the offspring is a mamzer. Okay, now that would make sense, right? That if a Jewish woman married to a Jewish man has an affair, has sex with this other guy who's half slave and half free, yeah, that's a Jew, and so the offspring of that intercourse would be a mamzer. That makes perfect sense. Rav Gaza said to me that Rabbi Yosef bar Avin once happened to come to our place, and there was an incident involving an unmarried woman who had engaged in intercourse with a slave. And Rabbi Yosef bar Avin rendered her offspring fit to marry into the congregation of Israel, not a mamzer. And there was another incident involving a married woman who had engaged in intercourse with a slave, and he rendered her offspring unfit to marry into the congregation of Israel by ruling that the offspring, the daughter, was a mamzeret. And Rav Shesha said, Rav Gaza told me that it was not Rabbi Yosef bar Avin, rather it was Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Zavida, and he rendered the offspring fit both in the case of relations between a slave and an unmarried woman and a married woman. That is the law, right? So the offspring of whether she's married to someone else or not, her offspring with a Jewish slave is not a mamzer, right? We already had that discussion. Rav Acha, the son of Rabba, said to Ravina, a Maimar once happened to come to our place and rendered the offspring fit, both in the case of an unmarried woman and in the case of a married woman who had relations with a slave. And the Gemara concludes, and the halacha is that with regard to a Gentile or a slave who engaged in intercourse with a Jewish woman, the lineage of the offspring is unflawed, whether she was an unmarried or a married woman. There it is stated explicitly. But just, the half-slave, half-free man, if a half-slave, half-free man engaged in intercourse with a married woman, both Jews, then the offspring is forbidden, both to a Jewish woman and to a Jewish slave. If the offspring marries a convert, his children will share his status of being half-slave and half-free. I'm almost done. If you have any questions, get them in. The Gemara cites a related halacha. Rava ruled that Rav Mari bar Rachel, who was the son of a Gentile father and a Jewish mother. That's why we have a sage who, instead of being Rav so-and-so, the son of Rav so-and-so, he's the son of a woman, right? Rav Mari bar Rachel, who was the son of a Gentile father and a Jewish mother, was fit to marry into the congregation of Israel. And furthermore, he appointed him as one of the officials, per se, of Bavel, of the Jewish community in Babylonia. And although the master said that from the verse, you shall place a king over you, whom the Lord your God shall choose, from among your brethren shall you place a king over you, it is derived that not only with regard to the kingship, but also with regard to all positions of authority that you appoint, the incumbents may be selected only from among your brethren who share your Jewish lineage. And nevertheless, with regard to this one, meaning Rav Mari, the son of Rachel, since his mother is of Jewish lineage, we call him from among your brethren, and so he is eligible. And so we took a journey, and we arrived at the place that we all expected to arrive, that the child of a Jewish mother is a Jew and is not a mamzer, unless his father was a very specific case of a half Jew and a half free man and half slave. But any other case, if his father was a Jew, or his father was a non-Jew, or his father was a slave, the child is a Jew and not a mamzer. Okay, let's go to questions or comments. Here we go. Bill Eldridge. Wait a minute. Who says Rav disapproved of the marriage just because of the guy's mamzer status? Maybe he was a jerk. Exactly. Bingo. You put your finger right on it. Rav didn't need to prove that his ruling, right, that the guy is not a mamzer, therefore, I'm going to give you my daughter to marry. Who knows what else was going on in this situation? We have only the barest of details about that story. There may have been a million other reasons why Rav didn't want to have his daughter marry that man. And Tom, is there any known or recorded instance in Jewish history where the son of a Jewish woman and a non-Jewish man later became a great Torah scholar? You must have asked that question before we came to the story of Rav Mari bar Rachel. So there you go. He became a great Torah scholar. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. No class tomorrow, Friday, because it's 7th day Passover. No class Saturday because it's Shabbos. And 8th day Passover, and we're going to come out of it too late on Saturday night. Sunday, I have a conflict. We have an event that we're going to, so no class until Monday. And on Monday, we'll do the highlights of the dafs, the pages for Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. So it'll be a highlights of 4 pages that we'll cover on Monday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. May you and all your loved ones be blessed with tremendous health, abundance, joy, meaning. May this Passover, the season of our freedom and of our joy, visit you with tremendous feelings of freedom and expansiveness and joy and all good things. Moadim l'simcha, good Moed, and early good Shabbos and Hag Sameach, and all the best, my holy sisters and brothers.